Okay, so hello, welcome. This is the video on case building / prep. We're your lovely host. My name is Jeffrey, and this is the legendary Noah Pinno. Today's agenda items, we're going to be going through two main sections. Firstly, some general prep strategy, and then we'll be going to more specific case building. We also brought up in a couple motions that we're going to look into a little bit more in depth, and we'll bring those up as we go along. So first thing, general prep strategy. Let's start first by talking about just proper communication, generally, stuff like that. Noah?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have really different strategies for prep. It works for me, won't work for Jeffrey, and might not work for you. But in general, I think it's important to be really open with your partner about what those strategies are and what works for you. So for example, I know I'm not really good at generating ideas or content at the very start, but I'm good at adding on lots of details to like push our case further than just the basic arguments of the stock cases. So for me, I need somebody who can do a lot of talking in the first like 5 minutes or so. And then I can start like adding things on and coming up with new content. And that it depends on different partners. I've had partners who need somebody to like explain the whole issue, the context to them, and then all of a sudden they're on and they can just start talking and coming up with ideas. So it definitely depends on the person, but sometimes, you know, you need to kind of start slow and have somebody give you some starting points. Or some people like to start with really big ideas and big framing of the case, whereas other people start with like very small arguments or context. And all of that is totally fine. There's no right way or superior way to prep. But what is really important is like figuring out what actually does work for you and doesn't work for you, and telling your partner what works for you and doesn't work for you, so that you don't end up in a situation where you have to come up with basically everything at the start, but you're not that good at it and it takes you like 10 minutes to do it. So, you know, kind of reflect on that as you practice a few times. And it's good to practice with your partner, but also to just debrief on what worked well or not well during prep. And have that like critical reflection afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think, as Noah said, the really important part of prep, especially if you're starting out with a new partner, is being really communicative with them, letting them know what like works for you in the past and what you want to, how you want to approach prep. One thing that my partner Robbie and I like to do a lot is we do silent prep for the first couple minutes of our prep, which I think is a really common strategy that a lot of people do to sort of gather their thoughts first. Noah, do you have any thoughts on silent prep as a strategy?
Yeah, this is something that like, I've changed a lot about how I debate and how I prep, like in the infinity years I've done debate, but silent prep I've always done, because I think it's just so valuable to get your head in the right space, to wrap your head around the motion. Honestly, the same as with all prep strategies, there's a lot of different things you can use it for. Some people need it to just like process what the motion means. Some people need it to like calm their nerves and get in the zone to like get from before the draw into after draw mode. And that's all fine. I think in general with silent prep, you should have like a sense of purpose, like what are you trying to get out of it? And that's okay if it's things just like de-stressing, but I think a lot of people don't really appreciate silent prep because they just sit there like not really doing anything, like watching people stress and scribble on their page as they walk to the rounds. And, you know, try it out, see if it helps you to just like jot down some ideas for brainstorming, or even to just like think like what are the burdens really in the round. All of that stuff I think is a great use of it.
Mm-hmm. I think something that works, the reason why my partner and I really enjoy silent prep, and Noah brought this up too, is that both my partner and I are like very anxious people. So it's something that sort of lets us get our thoughts together in the chaos right after the motion gets dropped. And another reason why I found that it's really, really helpful, or I find that it's really, really helpful, is because for me and my partner, we both have very like different approaches to dealing with different motions. So having silent prep sort of lets us collect our own ideas, like unadulterated for a little while, so that when we come back and sort of build our case, we have like two very different perspectives we can sort of approach it from. And I found in the past it sort of allows us to have more complex cases, or perhaps like prepare a little bit better for some other approaches that the other teams might do. So silent prep, yeah, pretty good strategy. A lot of people do it. I really like it. Maybe something you should consider when you're going into your next round. Do you have any further comments on that, Noah? Or
yeah, no, I really like to echo the idea that it's such a great way to get the most out of like having two brains behind a case. I guess the other thing I'd add is I think it should be done at the very start of your case, but there have been some circumstances where even like either me or Navin or someone else I'm with just doesn't get the motion. They don't know what it's about. They don't know the context, or they don't get what the burden is. And if you need to like explain to your partner the motion or have it explained to you, once that's done, still do silent prep. Like it should be done as soon as you understand the motion enough that you can start like that brainstorming, whatever. So it's always useful, and it's always something that you can get something out of.
All right, awesome, hot. So the next point, sort of for general prep strategy that we wanted to talk about is writing down your points and how you should organize your notes. Noah?
Yeah, so I think a good start is everybody should try to do two things. The first is that they should try to write down as little as they can get away with. It just gives you more time to focus on actually talking and coming up with ideas, and not bogging yourself down on reading off your page. And I think the second thing is you should have your organization that you set up for your pages or within a page so that you can really easily switch things up in the middle of the round. I think this depends a lot on if you're a first speaker or a second speaker, and even like extension versus width. So I have like a really weird strategy that nobody uses, and I honestly wouldn't recommend. Like I write down all my ideas on like one page and I have them like numbered. I can reorganize them however, but basically what I'm trying to do when I prep like that is I'm prepping the ideas, but my writing is just so that I have like a reference and I can just reorganize on the spot. And there's lots of different ways that people use that I'm sure Jeffrey has a lot of thoughts about for second speakers especially, but being able to reorganize is really valuable. It's the same reason why I think like in general, you shouldn't just write down refutation in a round in the order you hear it per se, but specific for prep, since you don't have any other structure that you have to obey, use that opportunity to be really flexible about how much you write down, and also like use as much paper as you want, but use as little words as you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree with everything Noah said. From my perspective as a second speaker, I really like to echo what Noah said before about flexibility. I think pretty much like if you're going to speak second, you shouldn't have your speech planned out in prep. You should be sure to like actually react to things in round. And I feel like taking down your notes, as Noah said, on like various sheets of paper allows you to do that to like the optimal degree. Like for example, if you had a point that you were initially planning on bringing up like later on in your speech, but the speaker right before you brought it up and you need to address it, like just having it so you can rearrange your speech really, really quickly, I found is really helpful just as a guide for how to go through your speech. Also just having a lot of room on your like notes helps you like add more specific things that you hear around, just being more reactive and in general having a higher quality speech. So as far as note taking, Noah, do you have anything else that you want to add with that?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll add is like, I think second speakers especially, you don't even need to write anything down at all once you practice this enough. So it's always something you can work towards, like being more in the zone for prep. At the end of the day, your prep is about you and your partner wrapping your head not only around your own case, but around the debate as a whole. And once you get to the level where you can start like coming up with case ideas pretty effectively, it would be such a waste for you to develop that skill of like coming up with really good content really fast, only to use the rest of that time writing down way more than you need, instead of spending it like strategizing that we'll talk about later. So there have been rounds where Navin and I just have entered not having anything written down on the page between the two of us, and we'll still walk out with a first or a second. And obviously that's just because we have a lot of experience, but what we've practiced is both of us writing down very little. Navin never writes anything in prep ever for any round. And also us being able to just talk about ideas and get to the point where you can spend that extra time strategizing. And both of those are skills that you can get, but it does require you practicing writing down bullet form instead of full sentences, like headers and impact titles instead of like core lines. And all of that is something that starts in prep.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Something that I found like as I got more experience with debate is like I definitely did find myself taking like less and less notes. And there were times where even like I would only take notes during prep to sort of help get the general ideas of like the burden of the case down. And then when the round started, I literally scrapped all my notes and just sort of wrote about stuff that I was reacting to in round. So yeah, definitely just agree with Noah. Again, these are not one-size-fits-all strategies, but this is stuff that's really helped us out. So that sort of is the first section we have about general prep strategy. The next, we're going to go a little bit more into case building, which is like our second main topic. And our first thing we're going to talk about is interpreting motions and identifying burdens. So I think this is when we can bring up our first motion that we have written down, which is this house prefers a world where trans activism remains separate from LGBT activism. So just sort of like generally, we chose the motions that we did because these are the motions that we find that a lot of new debaters have a lot of trouble with, especially in coming up with cases that, you know, sometimes people, for topics such as this, sometimes people are very like apprehensive of, you know, how to approach it because they see it as sort of a sensitive issue. So we think that like sort of looking at like the way that burdens fall on this is a good way of not running a problematic case. Noah, want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think actually, just tying back already to silent prep, if you're not really sure how to use it still, this is a really good place to start, is just to reflect on like the operative words. Is it this house would? Is it this house believes that? This house regrets, etc. So that you have to figure out, do you have to defend the implementation? Do you have to propose a plan for implementation? Do you just have to defend the idea? Is your opposition to this idea retrospective, or is it just in the present? And I think other videos are going to be talking more about specific motion words too. But just like in case people are not familiar, motions like this house would require a heavier like mechanization, so explanation of how you're going to implement it, whereas beliefs, that is more about just defending the idea or the outcome itself. And regrets would be regretting that a thing had happened, but there's no obligation whatsoever to explain how that would have happened or defend a plan for how that would have happened. And yet a lot of people kind of get like, they miss these details because they just jump straight into the ideas and talking about the case without first asking like, what do I, and actually Deb taught me this, like these basic questions to ask herself that I still use to this day. Even when I was like proing her, she's like, what do I absolutely have to defend in this round? What am I okay with defending to further how far I'm taking my case, but that I don't have to? What are things that I don't want to defend? And what are things that I absolutely cannot defend or I will lose the debate? And just kind of deciding like, what is goalpost one? Like, what's the minimum? What's the maximum? And where in the middle do you want to sit between those burdens? And that will depend a lot on the motion word, but I think it's a good way too to kind of work around even a complex motion like this about trans activism remaining separate from the rest of the queer community. Because a lot of people feel, exactly as Jeffrey said, apprehensive towards starting, how do I argue this without like accidentally saying something that might be poorly phrased, that might be transphobic. And a good way to not only like make stronger arguments, but equity filter yourself on these types of motions are just by figuring out, what does the motion ask you to defend? So in a motion like this, I guess I'll just like throw out a couple things that you could unpack by just reflecting on the wording of the motion itself without any arguments. The first thing is that you absolutely don't have to oppose the activism or the existence of any of the communities mentioned, right? Because the burden is about those two activist groups remaining separate, not that one is good or one is bad. And the other thing you can kind of interpret from it is that currently there's an issue with the two being put together, and one of them presumably the trans category. Trans activism has lagged behind and been at a disadvantage. So just by reading the motion that you want this group to be separate, you can tell that the debate is going to be, and the burden of the debate is going to be about proving that you improve outcomes for the trans community too. And those are a couple things that you can just figure out that show you, first of all, neither side has to oppose either of the communities, so there's no equity tension there. And second of all, you already know that when you start prepping in like minute 3, 4 of your case, everything should be related to how you improve rights, how you improve acceptance of the trans community. And you do that by just looking, what are the, if you just had to prove the minimum to say what this motion is about, the absolute minimum is that you're improving something for one of the groups mentioned, and preferably the group that's the worst off. And, start with that approach. It seems like really simple questions, but honestly, a lot of people skip over them because they're just overwhelmed at first. And a lot of people just miss the burden entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, Noah pretty much said everything that I would say. I mean, as Noah said, like, one thing they'll tell you at the beginning of all your tournaments, from your very first tournament to like the last tournament, is that there will never be a motion that the CAs will set where you will have to defend something which is like inequitable. So like, if your mind first goes there, you're likely not on the path which would lead you to the strongest case. So as Noah says, take it apart, think critically, think about, again, what do you have to do to win? Different actors. I mean, Noah pretty much said it all. Wow, Noah, you're great.
Thank you. I think the last thing to say about this is just maybe we could touch on prefers a world, because it's actually a really easy burden to navigate around. It's just not one that's very common. But in a motion like this, you're just comparing what a world where one situation was the case versus the other, and which one you think is a better world. So in a motion like this, you wouldn't have to defend how this activism had been separate. And that also means that if you were on Gov, and opposition tried to pin you for, and you could even strategize about this in prep, but on op, if a team was like, oh, well, how would you have like stopped trans people from participating in LGBT activism? That's not your burden. That's also not something that your case would disallow per se. So in your prep, when you start having extra time, ask what do you not have to defend? So that way you're preparing also for what op might throw your way. And you can call out what is not something you're willing to accept and not something you have to accept. And that's something that is good to talk about in prep too.
Thanks for that, Noah. Moving on, we're going to jump a little bit into the second motion that we have prepared, which is this House believes that the African Union should only offer financial assistance to countries who refuse to further participate in One Belt, One Road from China. So I think the first part we can look at, the first perspective we can take, is sort of how we can brainstorm some ideas / arguments in relation to this motion. We chose this motion because it was an IR motion, and we have heard from a lot of newer debaters that IR is a really big challenge for them. A lot of them are like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything in the world, like what do I do? So yeah, this is a pretty good guide for that. Noah, how would you start with brainstorming?
So I guess just the first review that I would do, already looking at burdens, just a couple things to clean up. It would be that Gov does have the obligation to defend only, but op doesn't have to defend always giving loans, right? So that's where the difference in the debate lies. And also it would be for further participation. So with that being said, if we were preparing, for example, government, I think what we would have to start with is trying to figure out, what is this motion trying to solve? And I think a lot of the time you can figure out what the motion is trying to solve and then figure out what your argument is supposed to be, even if you didn't actually know that argument or that it was true before. So in this motion, since the African Union is only offering financial assistance if countries don't continue or start projects with China for One Belt, One Road, then you can presume that your goal is that you want to limit the influence of China in Africa, and that you need a strong regional body in order to do that, and to contain the extent to which member countries economically link with China. So after figuring out that that's your goal, and I think that should always be the first question for coming up with content, because it gives you a direction. I think just without knowing much, you would probably know, first of all, that China is very economically powerful, and very economically powerful in terms of trade especially. That's information that pretty much all of us have. So that alone might suggest that there's a power imbalance, an economic power imbalance that you need to address. So you might come up with the idea that you need strong action, because if there's no strong action from the African Union, it's going to be very difficult for these member states to resist the possibilities of economic benefit from China. And that you don't even have to know about the way that BOR loans are set up. You don't have to know about the nature of individual African economies. You can just intuit that from the motion and know that you can make some basic arguments about the necessity for this policy. And then some other things that you might realize are good things that you could do is just ask yourself, what does financial assistance mean? So you could look at, for example, this could be loans, obviously, but it could also be like possibly infrastructure building if you were a government, you wanted to model it that way, or maybe your opening government does. It could also mean things like offering like help balancing currencies or like loan exchanges, currency swaps. These are all financial terms that I don't actually know entirely myself, which is why this is a good example. But you could say like all these things that it could possibly be. And all of a sudden you could talk about, if you know that one example of a country with an unstable currency, you could already talk about how that currency stability that you offer as the African Union could be more valuable by pegging to member states like Nigeria. So this is like just me rambling, and this is what prep is like, but effectively you just start with really simple ideas and really simple things you drop in the motion with really little background knowledge. And you can already arrive at things like, okay, we have a mechanism and it's going to be offering currency stability. Okay, we have a necessity about why this policy has to happen, and it's because of an economic imbalance. And you might not know those facts, but just looking at the motion and starting step by step, you arrive at them. So I guess the general takeaway I'd say, even outside this motion, is I think it's a good idea to brainstorm ideas and not arguments. Because if you started with arguments, you wouldn't come up immediately with the idea that currency was related. I don't even know if currency is related, but I'm going to say it because I thought of it. But you would arrive at that idea if you just start talking and just start with simple ideas. What are some issues that African economies might have, especially smaller ones? You could probably intuit that from any developing world economy. All of these things happen when you start with smaller ideas. And another thing that I recommend that you might have noticed is I didn't really think of these ideas in a direction of most important per se, or in a direction of trying to find impacts or trying to find argument titles. I think I myself even struggle with finding ways to organize all these ideas, but a common reason that people miss out on ideas is they, in the first 5 minutes, decide, okay, argument 1, resisting China. Argument 2, economic stability. Argument 3, development. But they don't know where to take those ideas because they started too big and they didn't chat about the world. And in my mind, especially on issues where you don't really know that much about, I, for one, am not very up to date on this topic, and it was my suggestion to do this motion. I don't even know if it's balanced. But all of these things are things that you can figure out by just picking at the motion, picking at what's implied, and starting with very simple things you know are true and generalizations.
Yeah, sort of just to add on that, I think I agree with Noah that I think this is a really good example of a motion where there's a lot of like potential arguments hidden within the wording of the motion itself, right? Like even picking it apart, like it's like very comparative, right? It's like African Union, financial assistance from them versus like One Belt, One Road. And like even just thinking of that comparison, that's can sort of set you down what I think is like a really comparative path where you're like, oh, what is the difference between financial assistance, right? And then that can sort of bring up ideas about like interest rates, for example. Like there's just a lot of stuff that like when you look at the wording of the motion that you can intuit, right? You can sort of see how this motion sort of breaks down into a comparison of like different worlds, different debtors, right? And as Noah said, like even just looking at the motion, even if you don't have like specific knowledge, you can sort of guess a little bit at what the differences are, right? Like interest rates are probably different from like a giant like predatory type of country like China versus like a more like regional like power block like the African Union, right? And that can set you on like a very nuanced thing about interest rates. So yeah, as Noah said, like don't go into it being like, oh, I have an argument, China bad. Like go into it like looking at the motion, applying it specifically, looking at how the worlds compare, and building off of those ideas.
Yeah, and see, like, I didn't even think of interest rates right away, and it's such a strong mechanism for this debate. And a lot of prep is just going to be you just throwing out ideas or like buzzwords and eventually something will click, or you'll see the links between all of the things that you've thrown out. And that's okay. Like, your prep, ideally, when you're building cases, you shouldn't have the argument like rehearsed. You shouldn't have spoken out the entire argument informally. You should have had all the ideas discussed instead. And that's what prep's about. It's about just wrapping your head around the case, not necessarily like a practice for your speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, like as Noah said, like I think something that when I first started debating that got like, it sort of made my speeches kind of like messed up is like I would get really, really set on me like, oh, I need like super clear like signposting. I need like argument 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as I've done debate a lot longer, what I found is like as long as I have the ideas down, in the last like 5 minutes, I can just be like, okay, this is the first one, this is the second one, this is the third one, and like the titles are not as important as your ideas. So as Noah said, focus on your ideas. The organization, you can organize it after. It'll probably make sense, hopefully.
And it's like, your signposting at the end of the day is so that the judges know how to group your content. So your signposting should also tell you how to group your content, but it shouldn't determine your content. It should help you make sense of what your end goal is and the end direction of each of your arguments is. So it helps you give it more emphasis, but it's not really about you have an idea, you have the signposting, okay, how do you fill it out?
Yeah, exactly. So I think diving maybe a little bit more specifically into this type of idea is like, what do you think the differences are between if you were front half or like back half in terms of how you would prep this?
So I think in general, for me especially, there's not a huge difference, but I think the biggest difference is like towards the end of your prep in the last 5 minutes and where you kind of go with what you have. So personally, because I write down very little and I use the same organization for front half and back half, I don't really think of my prep as that different consciously. So I think a lot of the differences are more subtle. It might depend on how you like to write things down or the dynamic with you and your partner. But in general, I think it's just thinking, how do you amend your content that you have, that you've got in the first 10 minutes or so, to meet the needs or the reactions of the round? So for back half, and actually for front half, I think the two skills that you kind of need to focus on and consider are your ability to predict and your ability to get away with not needing to predict. And what I mean by that is not only being able to see what is going to be taken or where back half might try to sneak in an extension if you're front half, but also making sure that you have enough content and strong enough framing that it doesn't really matter if you can't exactly see where things are going to go. So to like give some example or more specifics, if you were front half and you framed the debate as just being about one particular actor, you don't really need to predict all the different actors that back half could bring in, because you've already kind of set up your case so that you can overcome any sort of extension that you can predict. And that's a strategy that a lot of good front half teams do, is when they know they can't take everything or they're not smart enough to think of everything, they will be smart enough to frame it properly and kind of box out the back half. I guess the converse of this would also be just, taking everything turf burning. That I wouldn't really recommend unless you can do all of your points justice, because it usually ends up backfiring. But it's kind of the same concept, right? You need to be able to, it's good to try and predict what is front half going to run so that you don't spend your entire prep on back half coming up with an extension that front half just takes in the first 5 minutes, or even worse in the last 4 minutes of DLO, because that happens. But so that kind of like reading the round, thinking, what are the most obvious things that somebody might take? You also need to just prepare enough that if somebody takes 4 arguments on front half, you still have a 5th, and it's a good one. And I know that's like easier said than done, and that comes a lot with just practicing coming up with content and being more efficient at it. But it's not enough to just read the room and be like a chess player. It's also not really enough to just have all sorts of content and just pull something that isn't taken. And that applies for front and back too, because at the end of the day, you need to strategize for your own bench and how you're going to last through the round, or how you're going to sneak in the round. So I don't think that underlying strategy is different. I think it's the same because you're trying to figure out where can the round go and how can I manage that. But on front half, obviously, you have to think about not necessarily just taking everything, but framing strategically. And on back half, you have to look at where are gaps in front half that I can sneak in those extra details that I would have run on front half. And then how am I going to make those sound like the most important? So maybe your last 5 minutes won't be about coming up with new ideas on back half, like a fifth or sixth extension. It will be about prepping the framing already against your own front half if they take the basic version at this point. So you've prepped the like meta debate of your extension, not a new extension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another thing to add about like specifically when you're in back half, I think, and this is sort of general, but like as Noah said, I think it's especially important to be very flexible and don't commit too specifically to any arguments. But I do find that, especially from the perspective of a new debater, I feel like a lot of new debaters really obsess over not being seen as like derivative. But I think if you have a very like nuanced perspective on your point, and you see like maybe even though it's the same header, you have like a new impact or like a new like mechanism. I think that like you should remain flexible, yes, but make sure you have a good understanding so that you don't just like throw things out because you think they sound similar. I think something else is that like, as Noah alluded to, especially when you're in back half, make sure you have a really good idea of the framing of the round and like what the optimal framing for your side is. Like for example, for the particular motion we're talking about with like the African Union and like OBOR, like for example, if your front half goes up there and like spends 14 minutes just being like, oh, China bad, Xi Jinping like is awful, like Hong Kong, China bad, but they don't say anything about like, I don't know, potential benefits of the African Union. Like that could be a useful bit of like framing of the round that you can sort of pull out in back half and make it like a very obvious dichotomy in your favor, right? So make sure that you stay like alert during the round, understand what advantageous framing is, and if your front half misses something, like that is your opportunity to like go in and like bam. And I think something else about back half that we can talk about a bit is weighing of points. I think that like, I mean, it's sort of like a trope, but like if you do have like only like a few points on back half and like you're like, oh my God, our front half turf burnt everything. I have like 5 points, now I have 1. Like that's when it's important to really emphasize like, okay, why is this one important? Why is this 1 point like the most important point? For example, in the thing I brought up before, like if it fits into this new framing that you think is more impactful, that could be one way to approach it. So yeah, just in general, like remain reactive, pay attention during the round, like pay attention even during your own front half, because there's a lot of things that they can miss out strategically, and you could sort of jump in and put yourself on the top of your side of the space.
Yeah, and just roping this back to like things you can do in prep to make that happen and make that happen more easily. The best advice I ever received for back half is your extension should always be about solving a problem in the round, not just in the real world or in the debate. And what that means to me is that you can't predict in prep where your front half is going to like drop the ball. You can't predict what exactly your front half is going to miss. So for back half, what that means is that you shouldn't walk into the round with like an extension and a way that you're committed to organizing it. So that's why with prep especially, I really don't like the idea, especially on back half, of prepping arguments over prepping ideas, because prepping ideas is the thing that lets you just reorder your content in order to make sure you can react appropriately, can solve the problem and not just add things in the debate. And on front half, if you prep out ideas, you have a better understanding of what you can kind of like read the round almost better as it goes on about what the other side of the house is missing. And that way you can fix those problems before your back half has the opportunity to, because you prepped the concept of the round and not just your 3 arguments.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So I think the last thing we have on our agenda is, this is maybe a little more complex, but just sort of strategizing, sort of making your prep like how you will react to preempt things to make your prep work during the round. Noah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'd start with is, this is something that should be like your last goal as you start to get better. It's something you do with your free time to get the most out of your prep. It's not something you make time for per se. So more important than figuring out how you're going to beat OO is having something to beat OO with, right? Like if you're not bringing something to the debate, you can't do this. And I think what that means then is the end of the round strategizing should be about how are you going to react to best cases with your case? Because that's ultimately like the best debating is always engaging with the most charitable version of your opposition or gov team that you're opposing, and engaging with that in the fullest. So use your extra time for that kind of thinking. Like, what is the way that your extension engages with what your front half brought or will be bringing when you're in prep? So with that, because you should be prepping against the best case, I think that means that you're not just looking at how good the teams are, because if you just look at how good the teams are, you can either A, underestimate a team, or B, think that the really good Harvard team actually knows things about trans activism. They probably don't. Or the third thing that could happen is you're going to run a really weak case because you didn't take a team seriously, so you didn't prep against the best case of that side seriously. And that's a big mistake because that's exactly what straw manning always starts with. And that's what makes your case not really seem as comparative as it really should be. So I say it's best to not even pay attention to who's in your round at first. You should always prep like you don't know who you're hitting. You should always prep like you're hitting the best team you've ever seen, because you're going to, at the end of the day, come up with your case, the same case, no matter who you're hitting. The thing that does matter then is just using what you know about debaters at the very end to kind of complement the strategizing that you would do that we just talked about for front or back. So if you know that a team tends to DLO dump, you might want to spend a bit more time just prepping extra possibilities for extensions. But that shouldn't be your focus. That should always edit your prep. It shouldn't drive your prep.
Definitely something that comes with practice. So if you don't get this type of stuff right away, don't be concerned. Especially when you start practicing stuff like whips or judging, where you get to see like a whole round in like a more macroscopic sense. That's when you really get a more intuitive sense about the type of strategizing that Noah speaks about, right? So if this stuff seems really intimidating to you to begin with, do not worry. We have all been there. It'll start making sense as you keep practicing, and eventually you'll get as good as Noah, and you'll be able to bam, 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 know exactly what to do. So with that, I think that's the end of our agenda. Do you have any final thoughts, Noah?
Yeah, just there's a reason that we prepared this as a chat, and it's not just because we're lazy and because we want an excuse to talk to each other. It's because we're talking about prep, and prep is very fluid. It's very communicative. It's very informal and not really filtered. And you should just be comfortable with your partner. Don't worry if you're throwing out ideas that sound dumb. Don't worry if you're throwing out ideas that don't make sense or have holes in them. But also, like, don't stress too much on the structure. If you are already thinking about how you're going to like beat your front half in minute 6, like that might be the right call for that round or against that team. So don't take anything too strictly. That's always a rule in debate, but I think it's especially a rule in prep, especially because everybody preps so differently. I hope that you guys got some ideas about basic things you can incorporate or basic goals you should have in mind, and hopefully some things to avoid as well. And that will help you figure out not the perfect way to prep, but the perfect way to prep for you or for you and your partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with that, thank you so much for listening to this video. That's it. Debate is fun. Woo!
Yeah, thank you guys.